Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Hodinkee Radio. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by gentleman dealer Eric Wind of Wind Vintage. Eric's one of the earliest contributors to Hodinkee, writing his first article way back in, was it 2010, Eric?
Yes, correct.
Over the years, he's published the weekly Bring a Loop column, and you may also recognize him from appearances on YouTube classics like reference points for the Omega Speedmaster, GMT Master, Explorer, or his two talks for the Horological Society of New York. After his time as a Hodinkee contributor, Eric joined Christie's as a VP and senior specialist of watches. In 2017, he set out on his own with Wind Vintage, and surely you recognize his wrist and white cuff, always adorned with a beautiful or rare watch. Eric, thanks for joining the show and coming back to Hodinkee.
Thank you, Tony. Thanks for having me.
Eric, we're going to talk watches, of course. One of the things I've noticed, besides obviously the rare vintage watches and everything else you've been posting on your Instagram lately, a lot of great golf courses have been in the Rota this summer. Any particular favorites?
I just played Pine Valley 2 days ago, which I absolutely loved. I played Pinehurst #2 with Charlie Wind, which was just a pleasure to play with, my son. And we had just been there a few weeks earlier for the U.S. Open. The stands were still up, and that was a ton of fun. So it was fun because when we went to the U.S. Open, Charlie's like, I hope we can play it one day. And then turned out two friends of ours were going to play it and had two spots left in the foursomes. So I said, yeah, count us in. Winged Foot was incredibly hard. The West Course, where they have had the recent U.S. Opens and things. Yeah, it's been a kind of a lot of golf this summer, which is nice.
Is young Charlie giving you a run for your money yet?
He can, particularly on a given hole. He might beat me on a few holes here or there. Overall, he's 10 years old. He's getting stronger. I caddied for him in 4 tournaments this summer, and he just got third in the local drive, chip, and putt qualifier. So he advanced to the sub-regional. So we're really focused on that right now.
Oh, that's huge. Hey, congrats from all of Hodinkee to Charlie Wind on that. That's great to hear. Eric, I mentioned your background there. You were on Hodinkee podcast last time. It's been 4.5 years, if you can imagine, pre-pandemic years.
Yeah.
You remember the watch you were wearing that day?
It was a really cool little Eterna 30-meter chronograph.
So we've talked there and you've talked elsewhere about your background and getting into watches. So we're not going to get into it all, but I wanted to ask about some of the reference points videos you've done. You've done a number for Hodinkee over the years. Maybe there's some behind the scenes stuff that we can talk about, just stories that you've had from sourcing all of those watches, doing those videos, some of the coolest projects we do, obviously. I'm wondering if you have any favorite story from putting together. I listed a few of them, right? You've done Speedmaster, GMT Master, Explorer. Am I missing any?
Submariner,
of course, the big one. Any sort of favorite story you have from pulling those massive undertakings together?
Yeah, so it was with the Speedmaster, it was kind of gift wrapped because we had the Speedmaster auction when I was with Christie's. So it was not sourcing watches was not hard. I only had to source like 4 or 5. The rest were kind of from the auction. So that was pretty easy. Hodinkee, Ben and Will had rented a hotel room in Soho, basically where we recorded that one, right around the corner from where Drake's used to be. And then for the Submariner, it was a very ambitious project. Values in 2018 were kind of at a peak. So there were a number of watches that were worth about $1 million each. Total on the table of the 30 watches that we had kind of insured for was like $10 million. So it was a little bit stressful. We had 2 security guards. A number of collectors basically didn't want to let the watches out of their sight, / also were happy to kind of, chill out. So we were kind of recording in the Hodinkee office there, but then there were like 10 collectors to the side watching. So it was, and then 2 security guards. So it was a little bit more stressful than like the Explorer and GMT Master that followed, where values weren't quite as high, and it was just the video team, my co-host, and me. So, but yeah, Submariner, very high values, and it was a lot of fun. We've got to do one together one day, Tony. That would be a dream come true.
Oh, well, for me, Eric, I mean, come on. After watching you all these years, it would be a total dream for me. I'm glad you mentioned, first of all, Submariners, because I want to get into that a little bit more later. But I never realized there was an actual studio audience for that one. A question I'm sure you get all the time is if you were to put together another reference points, which model or which reference you do it on. You have any ideas in your back pocket?
I mean, you could do one I would actually really like to do is on the Vulcan Cricket.
Yeah.
That was one of my first vintage watches and kind of got me in the door to collecting. Obviously, I know a lot about them, slash have, I don't know, 15 in my personal collection that kind of are each as a different reference. So that's like a good core group. I don't need to source a ton of them. They're all like best in class, really special examples. So that it's not going to be like a profitable venture for me selling crickets too much, but that would be fun. The Memovox is also an awesome watch. Charlie Dunn and I love those, my colleague. And the Altavia would be good. The Seafarer is one I'd really like to do. Again, I've sold probably more Seafarers than just about anyone else the last 7 years. So, and there's not a ton of references. So it's not like we would need 30 watches. It's more like 10 to 15 maybe. So it'd be pretty easy to do. Those are my choices. If you want to ask here, that was above you about doing it, Tony, I'll do it with you.
Yeah, well, hey, maybe Ben and Will will listen to this, and we'll basically just send this in as the pitch document and get the film crew down to Palm Beach pretty soon.
I'll come
I'm pretty
up to New York. We could go to Chicago, whatever you like.
Yeah, we can have you here next week. Are there any watches in the reference points you've done that you either weren't able to source or just weren't able to find the right example that you would have loved to have for Explorer, GMT, Speedmaster, Submariner, whatever?
I would say perseverance to get everything I really wanted in there, but sometimes the example was not the absolute best. A good example is on basically the Explorer reference points. I was trying to find a very early one, early 1016 from 1960, which is like what Ian Fleming had. The one that I got, I was looking absolutely everywhere. The condition was pretty rough and it seemed to be reloomed, but it was the only thing I could find kind of pre-exclamation point. And it's interesting. Those watches, for whatever reason, from 1960 or so are often reloomed and often in really tough shape. Even Ian Fleming's own watch, Rolex, changed the dial on and hands. And who knows where the original dial and hands went, but it was not returned to the Fleming family, unfortunately. So it's hard with certain watches and ranges just take a beating.
One of the reasons I wanted to really get you on was to do a bit of a market update and just sort of general chatter and analysis. There have been a number of financial, export, and just other analytics and numbers and results that have sort of come up over the past few weeks. And I thought it'd be good to have you on specifically to talk about this type of stuff, which we'll get into here. So I'm just going to run quickly through some of the reports that people have been referencing that, depending on your interpretation, are either not as bad as some may think, or are kind of signaling warning signs for just a continued or sort of persistent downturn in the Swiss watch industry. One is the monthly report from the FHH, which said that exports were down 7.3% for Swiss watches in June 2024 as compared to the previous year. A lot of the public company results came out over the past few weeks. So Swatch was down 14% for the first half of the year. Richemont's watch division was down 13%. LVMH down 3%. Those are the big ones. Those are all the primary market statistics that we often see. Watch charts, which obviously this gets a little bit closer to the secondary market that you deal in. Their prices or their index that they track was down 2.1%. The ninth consecutive quarter of decline, according to sort of what they track. The quote that they had that really stuck out to me, they said, "It seems unlikely that secondary market prices will stabilize in the near future." So all these numbers kind of give you a slice of the industry, I think. We can talk about that particular slice and what it shows and what it doesn't show if you want. I think that in particular can be an interesting discussion. But I think a guy like you is often looking at different things and different indicators in the market than public company results or what something like watch charts might be able to track given the data and analytics available on the open internet. So I'm wondering if we could just kind of start with that question, really, what you specifically are seeing from your vantage point and what it might portend for the watch market.
It's an interesting time. I think people would say even for the last year, it's kind of spotty what sells and what doesn't. You can put up a really excellent watch and it could sell in literally 2 minutes, or you could have like a pretty great watch that's inexpensive and it just keeps sitting and you just keep lowering it and lowering it and lowering it until it finally sells. Um, the things that I've seen are one, condition is more paramount than ever. So top condition examples, the collector community and just people in general are a lot more aware of these things, which is good. But it means that I have to be super picky when I'm sourcing watches, if I'm buying it or taking it on consignment. You've got to be kind of nimble because again, like I every day am looking at the market and what I think will sell or not, but sometimes I'm wrong. So that's another thing. The silver lining I would say to this cloud is that people that are buying watches are actually enthusiasts and are if they're buying it, it's not really an investment because there's no way most of these watches will appreciate at 5% plus the next number of years compounding versus just having your money in a high yield savings account or something else. Like, I can't, I cannot tell anyone on any of these watches they're better off buying this than having their money in a high yield savings account. It's just, if you're buying it, it's because you want to wear it, you want to own it, you love it. And I think a lot of people the last couple of years literally were buying it just because, oh, it's worth more on the secondary. Oh, it's going to be worth more, all that sort of stuff. So that was I would say a negative to all the hype the last, since really right after the pandemic.
I've got kind of a two-sided follow-up there. The last watch you listed that kind of sold in 2 minutes, and then on the other side of that, you mentioned sometimes you're wrong or sometimes you get it wrong. The last watch that you were kind of wrong about that you thought might sell quicker or just get more interest than it did.
I sold the 3941J with a pink doré dial at a pretty strong price very, very quickly after posting it, within a day. And we're talking about a watch I was asking $175,000 for. So that was good. I mean, I wasn't sure it was priced strongly, but it's also one of those situations where it's like find another one. They're not like there's a ton out there. It was reflected on the extract. It was unpolished. It was really everything you wanted except not a full set. But it was just an awesome, awesome watch. But I wasn't quite sure if it would sell immediately or not. Royal Oaks have taken a lot longer time to sell recently. It's just, I think they're probably overproducing overall. They're somewhat of a putting a sign on your back in big cities to rob you. So people are cautious about that. But even Aquanauts, I know two people that were robbed of their Aquanauts in Europe this summer. So, that crime does have an effect on this because people want to wear their watch and feel safe and not feel like they're going to be tackled or stabbed in the arm or all kinds of other crazy stuff for their watch. So yeah, those are two examples.
I want to take this in a couple directions, I think. So does that first of all, I guess I want to talk about the Royal Oak. Does that for you present sort of I don't want to say an opportunity, but if the 5402 or the real true original Royal Oaks are something that's compelling for you from a collectability standpoint, do you feel as though it's like a good time to get in them again?
It could be. I mean, it's iconic watch. I love how thin they are. I love just the hour and minute hand. It's very, very hard to find unpolished ones. Um, I had a one in the first 100. It took a while to sell, but it did sell recently. So that was nice. It's just, I think it's honestly, it's a good time. I've had a number of, I would say, very savvy collectors say if you find like a really great A, B, or C unpolished one, please let me know because I'd love to buy it. And now seems like a lot better time than 2 years ago. So yeah, I think there's always, I mean, that's an iconic watch. Same with the Nautilus 3700s. Very hard to find in great condition.
You mentioned this with the 3940 and it having a Dure dial, for those who don't know, kind of this like warm dial compared to sort of the standard silvery dial that you see. And I'm
Hmm.
wondering if stuff like that, you're seeing a bigger delta. It applies to the 3940 and the 5402, I would imagine, like just seeing a bigger delta between those truly like rare and exceptional ones versus quote unquote average 3940. And if like the premium between those two things is continuing to sort of increase.
Yeah, it is. It's like if something's lightly polished, honestly, it's much harder to sell. So you could, like an unpolished yellow versus a polished yellow, it could be 45 for a polished one, 40 to 45, and then unpolished could be 60 to 65. So that's a big, big difference. And with everything else being the same, maybe both have an extract, and that's about it. Um, so yeah, it's people are picky, but that's a good thing. I think it shows that as a field, collecting's maturing. People aren't just buying the reference; they're understanding what they're buying more. There's a lot more scholarship now than 10 years ago, thanks to your work, Tony. And there's a lot more people that know what they're doing, which is a good thing.
Eric, you are better than anyone else at sort of patting people on the back and blowing smoke, I would say. So
I
well
just
done.
wish we had. I just wish we had our podcast still.
The people I get more texts or DMs about, hey, when is the Eric and Tony show coming back? So for the few hardcore listeners, it was never like a blockbuster hit, but for those who have been asking for it, here's half of the show at least. You're welcome.
Exactly, exactly.
One of the classic Windisms from your HSNY talks and other things, Hodinkee, I suppose. There are a few, right? Birth year watches, which you hate. One of the other ones is depth of market is something you always talk about. And I think you always give the 1016 as an example, 3940 as an example of the importance of depth of market. And it sounds like in a world that we live in now, it's more important than ever to just think about how deep these actual markets are when you're collecting a watch.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you saw it when you had the 1016 that came from me walking through the original Ivy Beach Antique Show in January. Everyone wanted to buy it off your wrist, which tells you it's a pretty deep depth of market. Uh, and that obviously there's more people potentially in the range of buying a sub 30K watch than a over 100K watch. It's just a huge difference in terms of how many people have the free cash to invest and put into something like that. So that's, I had a client who's a collector say, what's more stable, like a 20 to 25K Submariner, or is there something else if I want to think about, the watches I have, and when I pass away one day, they go to my daughter, should I buy more things in that 20, 25K range? And I said, if you really care about stability, you probably should buy like more date justs and air kings, like 14,000s and 5,500s and things, because those seem very stable to me. Great unpolished date justs and air kings, OPs, like that's not going to swing down like 40%, I don't think, just because there's way more people in that sub 10K price bracket than over 20K.
One of the things I mentioned there at the top was watch charts saying that there's no sign of the watch market bottoming out yet. Obviously, like what we're talking about now are these rare collectible watches, and that's what you focus on at Win Vintage, if I may say. But they're talking about the secondary market more broadly and how it doesn't show signs of bottoming out. I'm wondering if, first of all, you agree with that sentiment more broadly, and then if you feel as though there are segments of the market that have quote unquote bottomed out and you feel like are trending upwards or at least have stabilized.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I still hear from people that are kind of tangent. They're not as into watches as obviously you and I are, but they think that everything that's offered to them at retail is worth more on the secondary. And it's obviously a myth because a lot of stuff, like if you get offered a white gold GMT or something else from a Rolex retailer, you're going to lose money when you walk out the door. Like historically, is the case, but people still come to me and they're like, I just bought this at retail. What can you get me for it? I'm like, geez, what? I had someone do that with a white gold sky dweller recently. They bought it in an airport in Italy, duty free. And I was like, I think you're going to lose money on that one. But it's, it's an interesting thing. It's still, obviously, retailers are pushing out as much product as they can at retail prices, but very few things actually trade above retail. We know what they are, but even a lot of the Daytonas and things like that and precious metals are not really that much, if at all, above retail by the time you pay sales tax and things. So it's yeah, I think there's probably some more room to come down on a lot of these things. They're not rare. A lot of things are being produced, like crazy amounts. All the companies are obviously trying to get as much in terms of revenue as they can per year. Yeah, I mean, they're also trying to pressure their clients not to resell, both from a selfish perspective of not wanting to lose the retailer, but also because they just don't want to flood the secondary market on behalf of the retailers. Charlie and I joke sometimes with the AP cards. They give the little card with the scan the QR code. And AP is probably more aggressive than anyone in terms of we've sold a few code 1159s for clients that kind of had to buy them. And we've tried to keep the serial private, but it ends up changing hands. And then AP finds out about it. They have a whole team just looking up every serial. And we joke that if we take a photo of that QR code with our phone, a drone's going to come and shoot a missile at us. So no, don't scan the QR code. But they're more aggressive than anyone, which is obviously helps keep the secondary market values kind of where they are, because with it, just sitting in a safe, but they don't want to get blacklisted or blackballed for future Rolex.
Do you feel any sort of type of way about those types of practices, kind of, brands spying on their clients, for lack of a better term? I assume Win Vintage doesn't have a team that's spying on their clients to see where their watches have gone.
Yeah. No. I mean, I like it if I sell a great watch for it to come back, and I get unhappy if it goes to auction. But, I had sold a Royal Oak talking about Royal Oaks, an early Seafarer tropical dial that I had sourced from the grandson of the original owner at Christie's in 2017. It went for $60,000. Just spectacular dial. It came out of Brazil. The gentleman's grandfather was Brazilian, but into, all kinds of fishing and boating activities. So he bought it really for a purpose. And that gentleman owned it for a while. I then resold it for him to another guy who was a doctor. And then basically, rather than give it back to me, he put it at auction at Phillips, and it went for $43,000. And when I saw it in the catalog, I was like, oh man, like I have a few clients who would love to buy that watch. I think, I can't believe you put it at auction. It seems very risky. And he just was like, well, I'm just paring down, and it seemed easiest. And then he probably walked away with like $33,000 after seller's commission. Except he lost almost half of the money he had into it. But, that was disappointing just because I really loved the watch. But yeah, in general, people can do what they want with the watches. I do, Charlie and I do pay attention to some people really take good care of their watches. Like they look exactly like how we sold it to them. And some people are super hard on their watches, like even after 6 months or a year, if they come back, want to sell it. We're like, man, this thing looks so much worse. And then we sold it to them, and it's like, you almost don't want to sell them really amazing watches because you're like, it's going to live a hard life. And I'm sure at some point we'll see it back, and like, it's going to be annoying and make us sick to our stomach.
I'm glad you're bringing up Heuer a lot. We talked about the Seafarer at the top, and just again now one came up because one of the things I wanted to talk a little bit about was I think it was kind of one of your first real vintage loves was vintage Heuer, and just talking a little bit about the state of that market. It's always like a favorite topic of conversation because it's been so up and down over the past, I don't know, 10, 15 years now. But what's happening in that space now, and sort of how has it developed over the past, I don't know, few years?
It's interesting because we had a lot of great Heuers last year that were very, very hard to sell slash were sitting. And then January rolled around and like 80% of our Heuers sold January, February, March. I don't know exactly why. But suddenly, Carreras were pretty hard to sell. And then suddenly everyone wanted Carreras. We sold them all in a very short period of time. Um, I love Carreras, was one of my first nice vintage watch, or expensive one, I would say, was a Carrera, uh, that I found on eBay and got Jeff Stein's blessing to purchase back in 2010. But
Was it a 2447?
yeah, it was an S eggshell dial, which no one knew what that was at the time. I love Heuer. There's obviously a connection with Formula One and Formula One doing so well and such enthusiasm. And vintage Heuer, I would say a lot of the people that love Heuer are older guys who grew up, watching the Formula One drivers back in the 60s and 70s and kind of seeing the Heuer patches on their race uniforms and race suits and everything else. So that was kind of the core, I would say, of the Heuer collecting community and people into classic cars and things like that. But there's a whole, obviously a lot of us who were not alive then, like you and me, who love these things. And it's been, I would say 2024 has been very kind to vintage Heuers generally, very strong. Same for Submariners, funnily enough, which were very soft in 2023 and have come back in a big way in 2024.
Well, you talked about the Submariner reference points a little bit ago, and it really peaked in, was it like 2018, basically, when we did that reference
Yeah,
points? And I felt like
2017 to 2018.
yeah. What happened? It felt like everyone kind of wanted like a nice gilt sub at the time, and then they just, everyone got the gilt sub they wanted and moved on, or what was the sort of the the trajectory of what happened there?
Yeah, I think a lot of the demand was coming out of Asia, particularly the vintage Rolex Asylum group that's in Indonesia and in Hong Kong. So they were all wanting really excellent big crowns. And then kind of when they all got them, it's like what happens when two people really want something and they both get it, but there's no buyer for the third example. Where does the value of that, piece of art or something else go? It's very hard then to find a buyer. So that's kind of what happened with those. There was also, I would say nefarious work because the values were so high. There's a lot of relooming and other work that were done on some of these watches, which make people lose confidence. And then we just weren't really seeing great ones at auction. There haven't been many great ones that have come to auction recently, partially because people don't want to sell them if it's way below they paid or where they feel the value should be. So it was a whole series of things, but there's still a lot of great ones out there. Very much stealth wealth. Like if you look at that, like a great big crown, we have an unpolished 5510 on our site right now. It's, no one is going to really rob you for that watch. I feel like in Brussels or in Barcelona or Madrid, probably. But it's really, that's one positive. It's stealth wealth and it is a super cool watch on the wrist.
What about the later ones? Charlie Dunn, your sort of number one specialist over there, your
Yeah.
number two right hand man.
Yep. Yeah.
I hope he's hearing this right now. He wrote a great article about the 5512. Hodinkee, we did one about the 5513. Obviously, the 1680, the date version. These later examples, have those sort of generated any increased excitement? I mean, matte dials, earlier gilt dials. Have you seen sort of an uptick in interest in those recently?
Definitely a ton more interest. They were very hard to sell last year. Now we kind of sell every good one we get very quickly at probably 50% above where it would have sold last year in terms of value. So it is, there is a huge mentality, like lemming mentality, if you will, of collectors just going around thinking, oh, this is the next cool thing. oh, let me go back to this. This is now cool. Let me go to this. Like, you know, uh, that's okay. There's a collector conversation, but obviously it's good for people to actually buy what they like themselves rather than just what you read about online and see on Instagram. But that's why sometimes we see these big swings in values like Heuer dropping and then Heuer coming back. And, you know, it's really kind of the herd mentality. You know, Charlie, I gave him a 5512 last year when I promoted him to vice president of Win Vintage, but I didn't expect he would love it so much. I thought it would be a good thing to have in the collection, a great looking watch. Obviously, one of my favorites, kind of my first love in the world of Rolex. But you know, he really helped save the Submariner market. But he also, because of his scholarship on the 5512, there's now, I would say, material difference between the 5512 and 5513 values, which there probably should be because it's chronometer rated. It's much less common, and those sorts of things, like a vintage turbo Porsche versus a normal one or whatever. There's a material difference. People will pay more for the better example, and the 5512s were like 30% more expensive new. But, you know, in the past, no one really cared and they were basically about the same price. But now there's material difference. People prefer to get a 5512 generally to the 5513.
Is it mainly a rarity thing? That is that just like the entire explanation, and then it's much more difficult to find a really nice 5512 compared to 13?
I think it's not just rarity, it's the fact that the movement is actually better. It's chronometer rated, it's got more jewels, it's just a better kind of piece of equipment, even new. So yeah, people are beginning to understand that. I mean, there's a lot more focus on, I would say, movements and things, which is good for watches generally. It's not just aesthetics now. So yeah, that's a positive as well.
Yeah, it feels like chasing rarity for its own sake is kind of a losing man's game, right? There's always something rare. It's got to be like towards an end of getting a chronometer certified movement or like a nice, beautiful Dore dial or whatever it is. It's got to be like with an end in mind, and you shouldn't just
Yeah,
chase rarity for its own sake.
yeah, exactly.
Something you mentioned there was kind of the potential funny business that can scare people away from vintage Rolex, vintage Submariners. It's something I wanted to talk with you a little bit more about because it's something I hear very often. I want to get into vintage, but I'm scared to death of it. They'll reference, "Oh, I'd love to buy a watch from Win Vintage," or maybe a few other select dealers that people view as sort of in your class. But in general, it's a very scary market for a lot of people, the uninitiated, even people that are going to watch events at new watch boutiques or wherever else. I'm wondering what you feel we as a vintage watch industry or vintage dealers like yourself, auction houses, things that can be done better, opportunities to kind of improve upon the general perception of the vintage watch world.
I mean, it is very tricky out there. There's even some of these smaller vintage dealers who were selling watches for people and then not paying them. So there's all kinds of people who are owed money by some of these guys, and then you bought a watch from them, but you kind of don't have the title, and the person who owned it before you is contacting you trying to get the watch back because they weren't paid, but you also sent money for it. So it is it's very tricky. There's a lot of shenanigans at all price levels, whether we're talking about $500 vintage watches or $5 million vintage watches. So the best, I think, thing is just to be transparent. I wish there was more, you know, I mean, more enthusiasm, more collector gatherings, all of these sorts of things will help. Um, there, are- you know, at some point, I think grading will come into play in some sense with watches because um, we see that with baseball cards, coins, all kinds of collectible assets, and that helps. I mean, you wouldn't really even buy a $3,000 diamond without having a GIA certificate. So something like that would be helpful. It can bring negatives as well, which is that people don't really think about the watches as much anymore. It's more about the grade or less about the beauty of the watch and enjoying it. but maybe people will treat their watches a little better, not beat them up. So that's good. So yeah, there's a number of things that could take place, but the marketplace is filled with sharks. Um, but as I've kind of said before, there's a lot more awareness on condition now, so that is a positive. And like I said, people are buying these things because they love them, not because it's going to increase 5% plus per year right now. It's not likely that most of your watches will appreciate at those levels.
In a way, that's why it sucks even more if someone's getting screwed nowadays. Like a few years ago, there were a lot more speculators, and you kind of knew they were getting in for financial reasons.
Yeah.
Uh, I'm curious. You mentioned transparency. To me, that works on a couple of levels. Number one, transparency as to the seller themselves, who they are, what they do, how they operate, what kind of business they're operating, and then obviously about the watch itself. You said there's a lot of sharks out there. I'm wondering for consumers, clients, enthusiasts listening to this, uh, things that you can look for that are telltale signs of a shark, either the way they operate, or that the watch that they're selling might actually be kind of a lemon in sheep's clothing, or whatever the phrase would be.
Yeah. I think one, I personally wouldn't buy really anything of significant value from someone if I didn't know who they were, what they looked like, their name, that sort of thing. And it's amazing how many people send wires of $10,000, $20,000 plus to kind of unnamed dealers. You have no idea their background, their educational pedigree, anything about them. And I just think, like, did your brain shut off about this? And how can you be surprised these guys are kind of charlatans and sharks and
It
everything?
drives me absolutely insane though that I'm like going onto dealer websites and you're trying to poke around in terms of service or privacy policies that are obviously just ripped from standard template to
Yeah.
try to figure out their LLC name. So then you can go into the state records to figure out the
Yeah.
actual person. And
Yeah.
sometimes they're part-time dealers, or they have a full-time job, and they're doing this on the side, which has its own sort of things. But it's absolutely wild to me. Anything else?
So I would ask a few other things. Do you have a return policy? Generally everything, single thing we say, it sell has a 3-day return policy as long as it's in the same condition, um, for a refund, less shipping charges, which is not typically that significant in terms of the charges. So that's a good thing. A good conversation to have is, if I want to sell this in a year or two, would you help me sell it? And maybe buy it back or offer it on consignment for me to help me out. Like, we always try to do that and help people out, but it's amazing how many people buy something that's pretty expensive from a dealer, and a year or two passes, they go back and the dealer says, I've got two others right now, or whatever. Particularly when you're talking about $30,000 plus watches, that they don't want to take on selling it. That kind of indicates their confidence in the watch and excitement about that. So that's something else I ask. And just where the watch came from, honestly. Obviously, I see watches all the time that are offered around with replaced dials and kind of put together Frankenstein pieces. And it's good to ask where it came from. It's not as big an issue if it's like a newer reverso from the last 10 years. But when you're talking about 1960s, 1970s watches, you might want to kind of know where they found it.
Another Windism. Always have an exit plan, I think, is
Yeah,
a classic
exactly.
one.
Yeah, it is. And a lot of people don't. And it's tough to see.
I wanted to talk. This has kind of been a good discussion of the vintage watch market and the market more broadly. I wanted to move into one more thing for the last few minutes here, because you've started to dip your toe in the modern watch world against all expectations and against all odds, even some might say. You've done a number of collaborations over the past few years. You're friendly, obviously, with Jack Carlson of Rowing Blazers, and you've done some great Seiko releases, even a release with Tudor and Zodiac. The most recent one, which we covered on Hodinkee, was the Merci Tracksmith collab, which you helped with, had a nice sort of vintage inspiration on their LMM01 platform. I think they call it Blue Dial with Brigade numerals. So I'm wondering what you've sort of learned, or what you just didn't understand about the modern product development process that you've come to appreciate in doing all these limited editions.
I mean, it's cool because it's not that different in terms of what, companies were doing years ago, which is you got to focus on the dial that's usually sourced from one place and the movements often from someplace else, and then the case. And, you know, you've got to think about what the market wants for a specific watch. We did two different Zodiacs with rowing blazers. The Harry's Bar in Paris did really well with kind of a green dial. The World Time, which was kind of based on the Trading Places watch, we went a little more subtle with the black dial. I was kind of advocating for something with more color in terms of the dial. Um, but we went with the blue bezel and the black dial. People absolutely love the watch, but it was a harder watch to sell because I think people looking for a Zodiac want bright colors like pink or orange or teal or that sort of thing. So I've learned, it's not just about the watch design itself. It's what people want when they buy the watch and expect from a given brand. So I'm always kind of pushing that. Obviously, there are more collaborations in the pipeline for rowing blazers and also for wind vintage, which I'm excited about. But it's been a lot of fun. I think it's nice to honestly have like I'm not a huge fan of the whole moon swatch and kind of blood pond swatch, everything else. One, it's been played out, but two, they're essentially disposable watches. It's not exactly great for the environment, and they've got just tons of factories making these things. At least with like the rowing blazers, Seiko 5 Sports line, and things like that. Those are watches that'll last for decades that you can give to kids. They can enjoy. Like it's a cool thing that actually has some permanence in the market, and that people can enjoy and get compliments on all the time, and is not a watch that breaks the bank for a lot of people. So that's been rewarding.
Yeah, it's also cool. I think if I recall, the first article you probably wrote for Hodinkee was about the Polerouter, but I think you mentioned that one of the early ones that you wrote about was Seiko Rally Diver,
Yes,
which
yes.
obviously you brought back for your first run of
Yeah,
Seiko Rowing Blazers watches. So it's got to
yeah,
be cool for you to bring stuff into the world that sort of got you into the hobby, all those years
yeah.
ago.
And I
Um,
think because I've got a vintage eye, I mean, I really did not like the new Seiko Pogue chronograph. That's like inspired by. I was like, come on, guys! Like, I was pitching rowing blazers doing a Pogue quite a while back, but I can assure you it did not look anything like what they actually came out with. But they turned us down because they said, "Oh, we don't want to you guys to do vintage." Basically inspired models as much. We kind of stuck that rally diver in, but I was trying to do the Mac V SOG dials on a Seiko as well, and they said no, you can't do that because that's vintage inspired. I turned down on two of my better ideas, and I wouldn't be surprised if Seiko comes out with it on their on their own again. But I don't think it'll look as good as if I had designed it with the rowing
no,
blazer.
obviously not. Obviously not. One of the things you've done in some of your previous talks is you identify potential business opportunities or ideas for people in the watch business. I'm sure you get questions about this all the time too, as someone who made a transition to a full-time career in watches, first in the auction business and now setting off on your own. And the watch world has changed a lot since the last time you probably addressed this topic anywhere. But I'm wondering if you kind of, as you look around the landscape in any corner or part of it, if you see sort of ideas or opportunities for people that are looking to get into the watch business, either as an entrepreneur or as a dealer, whatever it might be.
I mean, it's very interesting. There's still all kinds of opportunities, perhaps around data, but there's every watch now. Um, I don't know. I get the emails, but I don't really use it that much. There have been other people have tried to do data plays with the auction houses, and it's always a big issue about whether they have the rights to use the data or the photos or everything, depending on the auction house. I don't know if ultimately at the end of the day that is a real business that's going to be worth real money or people will subscribe or things like that. There, there's tons of the data around new prices. Chrono 24 has data. obviously that's, I think, been interesting, and they've tried to do different things with the data. You've got the Subdial Watch Index that always gets a ton of attention because of the Bloomberg partnership. There's the data side to me has not really been cracked yet. But it's hard because every watch is somewhat unique in terms of year and condition and everything else, particularly with vintage. It's hard to say this watch should be worth this based on the data you're inputting in the system. Um, so yeah, that is that data side's interesting. I think grading is interesting. Blockchain technology still, has not really been used that much, but tracking where watches have been would be interesting, and being able to have like a record of where this Submariner's been the last 10 years, the collectors it's been with, how it came to market originally. Um, I think you see that with art because all important art basically has a whole record of where it's been the last 50 years and what exhibitions it's been in. I would still love to see more vintage watch exhibitions. We don't, the brands do it a little bit, like Breitling when they were in Chicago, they've done this kind of traveling exhibition, but um, there have been limited times. The Oak collection, that show in London, got a lot of press with a lot of his watches, but um, with cars, there's all kinds of, concours competitions and other things. With art, there's retrospectives on a given artist, and people want to lend their artwork to the show because it makes it more valuable and interesting. Um, but we don't really have that with watches as much.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it's difficult, but I completely agree with you that every time I see one of these exhibits, especially with vintage watches, it kind of renews the interest and appreciation, especially when auctions and some of these vintage watch shows that have a clear sort of commercial purpose in mind are great. But when there's no like commercial end and it's just an exhibit for its own sake, it can be really fun.
Yeah, it'd be it. Yeah, awesome.
The last thing I wanted to talk about, Eric, is I know you're involved with a charity that'll be doing an auction here coming in December. The LaViolette Foundation, and Doug LaViolette is actually someone I've mentioned on the show before. I've become friendly with him as well, but I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that auction, what it's for, and what people can expect.
The Brian LaViolette Scholarship Foundation was created in honor of Brian LaViolette, who is a really bright and wonderful young man who passed away when he was 15 years old. He had a swimming accident and drowned. And his family, of course, was, incredibly stricken with grief about it. And to honor his memory, they created a scholarship foundation and said, let's try to help people, in his memory. They had the idea a number of years ago of asking the Pope to donate one of his watches, which was a Swatch, to do an auction for the Scholarship Foundation. And Doug is really a wonderful guy. As you know, he's a little bit kooky and wacky in a sense because he has audacious dreams, and somehow they become reality. So he basically through the bishop in Green Bay requested to the Vatican for the watch, and it came. He then got in contact with me, and Green Bay is pretty close to where I grew up. It's about 40 miles away from Manitowoc, Wisconsin, where my parents still live, and basically said, "Can you help us? Would you want to donate? Would you want to get involved?" We did the first auction in 2022. It raised over $150,000. 56,250 was the end result on the Pope swatch, which was a world record for a swatch. And it was very, very exciting for something made of bioceramic. That was really, we got wonderful press. You donated a swatch as well, which was wonderful, Tony. I donated
not $56,000, but
no, but maybe one day. And I donated to Rolex. We had just a really fun, scrappy, crowdsourced, grassroots kind of auction. And we're doing the same thing now 2 years later. It's coming up in December in New York with Christie's. December 11th, the live auction, and there'll be an online auction as well around that time that runs for about 10 days. So I'm donating a really nice unpolished Datejust with a confetti dial, 1601. We've got already some really wonderful donations that have come in. So basically, we've got Jack Ryan's watch from the show Jack Ryan, made by Vortic. We've got some other really cool watches. A collector and client of ours just donated a vintage Patek Philippe Calatrava, which I was amazed at. There's a lot of really cool things coming in. Someone who was in the Olympics in Sydney donated his Seiko that was for the competitors only. So we're very excited about that. Just a really neat group of pieces coming in. And anyone that's listening, if you would like to donate, obviously it's kind of tax deductible. It's a really wonderful cause.
That's super cool. I'm excited to, see what comes of it. And I was at the auction in 2022. Excited to see what comes of the one this year. Bigger than ever before. So it's really exciting to see it grow. Thank you for coming back to Hodinkee and doing this, Eric. And thank you all for listening. Thanks to Vic Ottamanelli, our video and audio editor. And we'll see you all again next week.